Number 759, Ernest Miranda, petitioner versus Arizona.
So Miranda rights stem from a case, Miranda versus Arizona.
You have the right to remain silent. Nearly every citizen in America is familiar with this phrase, or pleading the fifth, a phrase so embedded in American culture that its origins may have been forgotten. The outcome of the infamous 1966 Miranda v. Arizona court decision clarified and ultimately redefined the powers of the Fifth Amendment to develop a legal frontier and the Miranda rights enforced to this day to prevent self-incrimination, protect personal rights, and avoid coercion, unjust authoritative pressure, or involuntary statements for a potentially guilty suspect. But what does that even mean? Before going into the specifics of Miranda v. Arizona, it is critical to understand that before this case, confessions were all voluntary and the suspect was responsible and accounted for, regardless of their mental state at the time of confession or whether they were pressured into delivering an involuntary statement.
The United States Constitution gives people that right against self-incrimination, but what Miranda does is it really allows people to proactively protect that right.
The first critical case on this question of rights against self-incrimination was the 1886 Boyd v. the United States case. Ultimately, the court held that the Fourth Amendment preventing unreasonable search and seizure and arbitrary arrest must be upheld. The 1800s and 1900s were both times that rights and reforms were being gained throughout the country for different groups of people. In 1924, the right against self-incrimination was found to apply only in some civil cases. In the case McCarthy v. Arnstein, it was ruled that the Fifth Amendment and its powers applied to defendants in civil cases, in addition to criminal cases, if the confession would result in criminal prosecution. This was crucial because it assisted in the gradual expansion of the Fifth Amendment.
The Fifth is, it's an incredibly powerful, part of our Constitution. Essentially, there are different parts of the Fifth Amendment. An individual cannot be compelled to testify against themselves. And so they essentially, much in line with the Miranda rights, they have the right to remain silent essentially through their entire trial.
Fast forwarding to March 13, 1963, Ernesto Miranda, a Mexican immigrant living in Phoenix, Arizona, was arrested in his home and questioned at a police station for a rape and kidnapping that occurred.
On the prosecutorial side, you're looking to make sure that a person has been Mirandized, and that means that their Miranda rights have been provided to them when they've been arrested. So in those situations, when you're a prosecutor, you're gathering evidence to prove the case. So whatever charges that you have put forth and you're alleging that a person is guilty of certain actions, you want to make sure that your evidence can come into court.
2 hours into the investigation, they cranked a written confession out of Miranda. The written confession was entered as evidence into the trial, even though the officers acknowledged that they did not advise Miranda of his right to an attorney during or prior to the investigation. The jury found Miranda innocent, but on appeal, the Supreme Court of Arizona held that Miranda's rights were not violated because he specifically failed to request counsel.
Once you got arrested, the police would ask you what happened and what took place, and a lot of times people felt compelled to answer those questions. Now you're actually told you have the right against self-incrimination. You don't have to talk to the police, and if you need a lawyer, one will be appointed to you. And so it really changed the scope of that interaction between the public and law enforcement, and then what could be asked.
By law enforcement and the commission of having committed, or if you are suspected of committing a crime, and it's your right to speak to the lawyer, have them to counsel you for advice or any legal advice, and for law enforcement to not take advantage of the fact that you might not know that you have the right to an attorney and you have the right to remain silent if you choose to do so.
After the Supreme Court of Arizona made its ruling, the state of Arizona retired him without introducing his confession into evidence, causing Miranda to be convicted and sentenced to 20 to 30 years in prison. Chief Justice Earl Warren delivered the opinion of the 5-4 majority in favor of Miranda, stating that his Fifth Amendment rights were violated and that a reading of one's rights prior to an arrest is mandatory, and that evidence from an interrogation without rights being read cannot be used in trial to prevent unjust self-incrimination.
We always made that determination that this individual was apprised of their Miranda rights, and that they had acknowledged that they could, remain silent, they could have an attorney there. And that that the individual either exercised those rights, or if there was a violation, we looked to see whether or not there was a decision, or there was a motion to exclude any of the information that was given as part of that.
Justice Tom C. Clark developed a dissenting opinion that his colleague's opinion was a strict interpretation of the Fifth Amendment, and found that states should have the burden of proof that the suspect read their rights, but that confessions and evidence should not be excluded during an investigation just because rights were not read to them. Justice White also wrote a dissenting opinion arguing that defendants are only protected by the Fifth Amendment from giving self-incriminating testimony if they are compelled to, since custodial interrogation in his eyes were not coercive or unjust.
There are still people that run the justice system at the end of the day, and despite all our best efforts, we are all flawed in some capacity, or at least we all have our own limitations.
The short-term impact was that Miranda was convicted on appeal to the maximum 30 years for rape, kidnapping, and robbery. In the 1966 case, the Supreme Court ruled that detained criminal suspects must be read their Miranda rights to prevent self-incrimination. And 4 years later, after Miranda's release on parole, Miranda was stabbed to death. The newly created Miranda rights added to the Fifth Amendment to ensure that the rights against self-incrimination were carried out, though Miranda himself was still put in jail, which raises the question of what justice really is, and how just our system really is.
People grow up with their own biases, and if efforts are not taken to unlearn them and learn more productive ways to interact with people, we can have a justice system that is not as just as it could be. And I think you've definitely seen examples of that, not just in recent years, but in most of human history, as we continue to strive to make our justice system more reflective of the desires of the people that are affected by it.
The long-term impact of this case includes that Miranda rights are still in effect to this day. In the 1993 case United States v. James Daniel Good, Real Property, the Supreme Court held that, as protected under the Fifth Amendment, property owners were entitled to advance notions and a full hearing before their property is confiscated, as police found drugs and paraphernalia in James Daniel's home, and he pleaded guilty, as the judge authorized an ex parte which involved property seizure without notifying the individual. This was only possible because of the advancements of the Fifth Amendment following the Miranda case. Law enforcement behaviors and routine changed with the ruling of this case.
Well, if I see one person attack and batter and assault another person, I don't need to ask them, I don't need to read them their Miranda rights because I saw what they did, and that's good enough for me to go as a witness.
Ultimately, the Fifth Amendment and Miranda rights continues to prove its importance as it protects individuals from self-incrimination and coercive interrogations. It is still relevant as police officers have to carry around a book with Miranda rights listed. Miranda rights give power to an individual to understand their rights and make intelligent and voluntary statements. Additionally, if law enforcement contains racist individuals who arrest with an intent to incriminate, Miranda rights ultimately protect an individual from essentially being imprisoned on the basis of racism. Miranda v. Arizona was a legal frontier for protecting the rights of the accused. In Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, attorney Atticus Finch powerfully stated, "A court is only as sound as its jury, and a jury is only as sound as the men who make it up." Lady Justice has been blinded and shackled throughout our history on numerous occasions, but slowly she is freed from the hands of greed, arrogance, and prejudice in our nation. Slowly the people are heard and represented. Miranda v. Arizona is more than a case, it is a legacy, because every time you hear that you have the right to remain silent, you are witnessing Lady Justice rise to the occasion and perform her due diligence.